They said I was worthless. Now my dad's life depends on the son. They abandoned aka me when they discovered I was the only compatible bone marrow donor after he developed leukemia at 58 years old. The hospital conference room felt like a cage. My half-brother Derek shifted uncomfortably in his $1,000 suit, while my stepmother Patricia gripped the mahogany table edge so hard her knuckles blanched white. The oncologist had just delivered the verdict: stage 4 acute myeloid leukemia, aggressive, fatal within months without a bone marrow transplant. They'd tested everyone. Derek wasn't a match. Patricia's sister wasn't a match. The extended family, the country club friends who'd co-signed their fake perfect life, none of them could save Richard Bennett, but I could. The son he'd called the mistake at my high school graduation before walking out forever could save his life. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. Derek actually had the audacity to reach across the table toward me, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "Marcus, please, we know things were complicated, but he's still your father." I didn't move. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, watching them squirm in their designer chairs. Then I stood, smoothed my shirt, and walked out without a single word. My name is Marcus Alexander Bennett, though for 16 years I was Marcus Sullivan, my mother's maiden name. The one I took after Richard decided his new family didn't have room for the baggage from his first marriage. I'm 34 now, a structural engineer living in Portland, Oregon, exactly 2,137 miles from the San Francisco mansion, where Richard built his real estate empire on the foundation of abandoned promises. I learned about his leukemia diagnosis not from a phone call or a letter, but from a Facebook message from Derek's wife, Stephanie, a woman I'd met exactly once at a grocery store 5 years ago. "Your father is sick," she wrote, as if that word still meant something to me, as if 16 years of silence could be erased with 3 words and a desperate emoji. The message came with a photo attachment, Richard in a hospital bed, looking smaller than I remembered, his skin gray against white sheets. They wanted me to feel something. They'd miscalculated entirely. I need to take you back to understand why that hospital conference room felt like victory, not crisis. Back to the summer of 2007, when I was 18 years old and Richard Bennett stood in the driveway of our modest Sacramento home, loading boxes into his BMW, while my mother watched from the kitchen window, her face carved from stone. He'd been having an affair with Patricia for 2 years. Patricia, his real estate firm's marketing director. 15 years younger, childless, ambitious. She was already 3 months pregnant with Derek. "You're old enough to understand," Richard told me that day, his hand on my shoulder with all the warmth of a business handshake. "Your mother and I, we've grown apart. Patricia and I are building something new. This is better for everyone." I asked if everyone included me. He looked past my shoulder, toward the BMW where Patricia waited, her sunglasses reflecting the afternoon light. "You'll visit," he said. "Holidays, summers." Then he climbed into his car and drove toward his new life, and that was the last meaningful conversation we had for 16 years. The visits never happened. Richard and Patricia married 4 months later in Napa Valley. I wasn't invited. Derek was born in February 2008. I received a birth announcement in the mail with a generic card that said, "Big Brother," like I was supposed to celebrate. My mother worked double shifts as a medical transcriptionist to keep our house. I put myself through Oregon State on scholarships and weekend construction jobs, graduated with honors in civil engineering, built a career designing sustainable infrastructure for coastal cities. Richard sent exactly 3 birthday cards in 16 years, generic drugstore cards with $50 bills inside, and his signature, nothing else, no phone calls, no emails, no interest in who I'd become. Meanwhile, Derek got private schools, European vacations, a BMW for his 16th birthday, a trust fund, and a father who showed up to every lacrosse game. Social media told me everything Richard never said. Photos of Derek's high school graduation with Richard beaming in the front row, of family ski trips to Aspen, of the $30,000 wedding Richard threw for Derek and Stephanie last year at the Fairmont. I wasn't invited to that either. Then came Patricia's Facebook message in March, clinical and desperate in equal measure. Richard's diagnosis, stage 4. Bone marrow transplant needed urgently. Derek tested immediately. Not a match. Patricia's family tested. No matches. They'd exhausted their country club network, their business associates, even hired a private medical team to search donor registries nationwide. Nothing. The doctors finally suggested they track down any biological relatives they might have overlooked. That's when my name resurfaced in Richard's medical history like a ghost he'd tried to bury. Patricia's message ended with, "The doctors say you might be his only chance. Please call me." I didn't call. I let 2 weeks pass, watching my phone light up with increasingly frantic messages from numbers I didn't recognize, voicemails from Patricia's sister, texts from Derek begging me to be the bigger person. The irony was exquisite. They needed me to be bigger than the man who'd made me feel microscopic my entire adolescence. I finally agreed to testing, but only after my attorney reviewed the hospital's consent forms and added clauses they'd never seen before. I made them wait another week while my lawyer negotiated terms. When I walked into that hospital in San Francisco for the blood draw, Derek was waiting in the lobby like a puppy hoping for treats. "Thank you for coming," he said, trying to sound sincere. "This means everything to Dad." I smiled and signed the forms. The results came back in 72 hours. Perfect match, 10 out of 10 HLA markers, the genetic lottery they'd been praying for. The oncologist called it remarkable compatibility. I called it poetic justice. They scheduled the family meeting for the following Monday, the one where Patricia would outline the transplant timeline, where Derek would probably hug me, where Richard would finally have to speak to me directly after 16 years of silence. They had no idea I'd spent those 72 hours making phone calls of my own, pulling threads I'd noticed unraveling in their perfect facade, reaching out to people who knew things the Bennett family wanted buried. I showed up to that meeting with a leather folder under my arm, the kind lawyers carry into depositions. Patricia kept glancing at it nervously throughout the oncologist's presentation about harvest procedures and recovery timelines. When the doctor finished and left us alone in the conference room, Derek leaned forward with his rehearsed gratitude speech ready. That's when I opened the folder and slid a single document across the table toward Patricia. "Before we discuss saving Richard's life," I said, my voice steady as bedrock, "I think we should discuss the Clearwater Properties fraud investigation." Patricia's face drained of color so fast, I thought she might faint. Derek looked confused, glancing between us like he'd missed a crucial plot point. The document was a subpoena notice. Richard's real estate firm under federal investigation for mortgage fraud, inflated property appraisals, and money laundering spanning 7 years. I'd found out through a former colleague whose sister worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office. The investigation was sealed, confidential, not yet public. Richard and Patricia thought they had months to prepare their defense. They were wrong. Patricia's hand trembled as she reached for the subpoena copy, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her pale skin. Where did you get this?" Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't answer. Instead, I slid a second document across the table. A spreadsheet detailing shell companies, falsified inspection reports, and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Derek finally found his voice. "What the hell is this, Marcus?" He tried to sound authoritative, but it came out whiny, petulant. "This is your father's legacy unraveling," I said calmly. "Clearwater Properties has been defrauding clients for years, inflating appraisals, bribing inspectors, selling properties with hidden structural damage. The Sanderson building collapse last year, the one that injured 4 people, that was a Clearwater property. Richard signed off on inspections he never conducted." I watched Derek's face cycle through confusion, denial, and dawning horror. He'd been working at Clearwater for 3 years, playing executive in his corner office, completely oblivious that his trust fund was built on fraud. Patricia tried to recover. "These are allegations, unproven accusations from competitors trying to..." I cut her off by sliding a third document across the mahogany. "These are email chains between Richard and the chief building inspector, William Horvath, discussing payment schedules for overlooking code violations. Your husband's personal email, Patricia. The one he thought was secure." Her mouth snapped shut. The silence in that conference room was beautiful. I let it stretch, watching them realize simultaneously that the son they'd thrown away had grown into someone far more dangerous than they'd imagined. Derek tried a different approach, his voice dropping into fake camaraderie. "Look, Marcus, I don't know what you think you found, but Dad's dying. He's got maybe 4 months without the transplant. Whatever issues you have with his business..." "4 months," I interrupted, leaning back in my chair. "That's interesting timing, because the federal grand jury convenes in 6 weeks. The indictments are coming, Derek. Your father will be arrested, probably at his office, definitely with cameras present. Patricia will be named as a co-conspirator. She signed off on the fraudulent marketing materials. And you? I looked directly at Derek, watching him squirm. You're listed as Director of Acquisitions. Your signature is on at least 40 compromised deals. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed in the silence. Patricia's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. What do you want? She finally whispered. It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in 16 years. I stood up, collecting my documents and sliding them back into the leather folder. I want you to understand something very clearly. I am the only person on this planet who can save Richard's life. Perfect 10 out of 10 match. Medical miracle. But I'm also the only person who knows the full extent of your fraud operation. I've spent the last 2 weeks talking to people. Investigators love a cooperating witness, especially one with engineering credentials who can explain exactly how those building inspections were falsified. Derek shot to his feet. You're blackmailing us? Dad is dying and I'm giving you perspective, I said. For 16 years you've had everything while I had nothing. Now I have something you need desperately, and you have nothing I want. Patricia's lawyer instincts finally kicked in. What are your terms? Terms? Like this was a business negotiation. Like my bone marrow was a commodity they could purchase. I almost laughed. I'll be in touch, I said, and walked toward the door. Wait! Derek's voice cracked with panic. The doctors said Dad needs the transplant within 8 weeks or his condition deteriorates too far. You can't just... I turned back, my hand on the doorframe. I can do exactly that. I can walk away and let nature take its course. Or I can save him. But either way, Derek, you're going to learn what it feels like to be powerless. To need something desperately from someone who has no reason to care whether you live or die. Patricia stood up, her composure cracking completely. He's your father. Whatever he did, whatever mistakes he made, that's blood. You can't just... He's a stranger who happens to share my DNA, I corrected. Blood means showing up. It means 18 years of support, not 18 years of silence. You wanted me to be the bigger person? Fine. But bigger people get to set the terms. I left them in that conference room and drove to my hotel in downtown San Francisco, a boutique place near Union Square that cost more per night than my first apartment's monthly rent. My phone started ringing before I reached the parking garage. Patricia, Derek, even a number I didn't recognize that left a voicemail from Richard's personal assistant. I ignored all of them. Instead, I called my mother in Sacramento. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with surprise. Marcus, is everything okay? I told her everything. The diagnosis, the match, the meeting, the subpoena. She listened in silence, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. What are you going to do? She finally asked. I don't know yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to watch it all burn, but part of me... I trailed off. Part of you remembers when he was your dad, she said softly. Before Patricia, before Derek, when he taught you to ride a bike and took you to Giants games. That person doesn't exist anymore, Mom. Maybe not, she agreed. But the question isn't about him, sweetheart. It's about you. What kind of man do you want to be when this is over? I sat in my hotel room that night, looking out at the San Francisco skyline, the same view Richard probably enjoyed from his Pacific Heights mansion. My phone buzzed constantly with messages I didn't read. Around 11 p.m., a new email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. Richard's personal email, the one from the subpoena documents. The subject line read, "From your father." I stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it. The message was short, typed with obvious effort, probably from his hospital bed. Marcus, I know I have no right to ask anything from you. I know I failed you in every way that matters. Patricia tells me you have information about Clearwater. She's probably right. You were always smarter than I gave you credit for. If you want to watch me die, I understand. I deserve that, but Derek doesn't. He's innocent in this. Whatever happens to me, please don't destroy his life too. He's your brother, Richard. I read it 3 times, looking for manipulation, for the angle, but it just sounded tired, defeated, human. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I'd compiled over the past 2 weeks. The evidence was damning. Emails, financial records, witness statements from former Clearwater employees I'd tracked down through LinkedIn. I had everything the U.S. attorney would need to build an airtight case. I also had something else, A plan that had been forming since the moment Patricia's desperate Facebook message appeared on my phone. A plan that required patience, precision, and a willingness to make them all understand exactly what they'd thrown away 16 years ago. The next morning, I called Patricia. She answered before the first ring finished. "Marcus, thank God. We need to talk about the Bentley Hotel, noon." I interrupted. "Bring Derek. Come alone or I walk." I hung up before she could respond. The Bentley was a 5-star restaurant near Fisherman's Wharf, the kind of place where Richard used to take business clients. I arrived early, got a private corner booth, and ordered coffee I didn't drink. Patricia and Derek showed up at 11:58, both looking like they hadn't slept. Patricia had aged 5 years in 24 hours. Derek's expensive suit looked rumpled, his signature confidence replaced with nervous energy. They slid into the booth across from me, and Patricia opened her mouth to speak. I held up my hand. "I'll talk. You'll listen." I slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside are copies of everything I've compiled on Clearwater Properties. Emails, financial records, witness statements, engineering reports on the compromised buildings. It's organized, indexed, and ready for federal prosecutors. Patricia's hand moved toward the envelope like it might bite her. "There's also a second document," I continued. "A complete accounting of every dollar Richard spent on Derek over the last 16 years. Private school tuition, sports equipment, vacations, the BMW, the trust fund, the wedding. It totals $1,247,000. Derek's eyes went wide. He clearly had no idea the actual number. "I don't want money," I said before they could interrupt. "I want you to understand the price of abandonment, of choosing one son over another, of building an empire on fraud while teaching Derek that success means cutting corners and lying to clients." "Marcus, please," Patricia started, but I wasn't finished. "Here are my terms. 1. Richard writes a full confession detailing every fraudulent deal, every bribed inspector, every compromised building. He signs it, notarizes it, and I hold it as insurance." Derek started to protest, but Patricia grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks. 2. Derek resigns from Clearwater immediately and cooperates fully with federal investigators. He testifies against Richard and provides documentation for every deal he touched. In exchange, I'll advocate for immunity based on his cooperation and his ignorance of the full scope of the fraud. Derek's face went from red to white. "You want me to send my own father to prison?" "I want you to take responsibility," I corrected. "Something Richard never taught you. The investigators are going to uncover this with or without your help. This way, you might avoid prison yourself." Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. "And 3. I want Richard to look me in the eye and explain why Derek was worth $1,247,000 and I was worth 3 birthday cards." The restaurant noise faded into background static. Patricia and Derek sat frozen, processing. Finally, Derek found his voice. "If I testify against Dad, he'll go to prison. Probably for years. The leukemia will kill him before he serves 6 months." "Yes," I said simply. "Those are the consequences of his choices. But if he confesses and you cooperate, at least Derek avoids prosecution. Your trust fund might survive. Patricia, you might keep the house after the legal fees and restitution. You get to rebuild, which is more than Richard gave me at 18. Patricia's lawyer brain was working overtime, calculating angles. "What about the transplant? After Richard signs the confession and Derek agrees to cooperate, I'll do the bone marrow harvest," I said. "I'll save his life so he can live long enough to face what he's done. So he can sit in a federal courtroom and hear victims testify about the Sanderson building collapse. So he can watch Derek choose integrity over loyalty." Derek slumped back in his seat, his face buried in his hands. Patricia stared at me with something between horror and grudging respect. "You've thought this through," she said. "I had 16 years to think," I replied. 16 years of watching social media posts of Derek's perfect life while I worked construction jobs to pay for college. 16 years of birthday cards with $50 bills and no phone calls. Yes, Patricia, I've thought this through." She opened the manila envelope with shaking hands, scanning the documents. Her face went through several emotions: denial, anger, fear, resignation. "This is enough to destroy everything," she finally said. "It's enough to reveal the truth," I corrected. "Richard destroyed it himself. I'm just holding up a mirror." Derek looked up, his eyes red. "What if I refuse? What if I don't testify?" I smiled, and it wasn't kind. Then I walk away, Richard dies, and I send every document to the U.S. Attorney's Office anyway. You go to prison along with Patricia. The difference is, without your cooperation, you're a co-conspirator instead of a witness. You'll serve 8 to 10 years instead of walking free. Your choice, little brother. The words, little brother, hit him like a physical blow. He'd never thought of me that way, never considered what it meant to have a sibling erased from existence. You're enjoying this, he said, accusation thick in his voice. No, I said honestly. I'm not enjoying it, but I'm not going to pretend 16 years of abandonment didn't happen. I'm not going to donate my bone marrow and watch you all go back to your mansion and forget I exist. This time, you'll remember. Every single day, you'll remember what it cost to throw me away. Patricia closed the envelope, her decision made. I need to talk to Richard. Show him these documents. Give him a chance to... You have 48 hours, I interrupted. After that, the grand jury gets everything and I'm on a plane back to Portland. Richard can make his peace with whatever God he believes in. I stood up, dropped $200 bills on the table to cover a meal none of us had ordered. One more thing, I said, looking directly at Derek. When this is over, when Richard is in prison and you're rebuilding your life, I want you to think about something. Think about all the times Dad showed up for your lacrosse games. Think about your 16th birthday BMW. Think about your trust fund and your wedding and your corner office. Then I want you to imagine growing up with none of that, with nothing but 3 birthday cards in 16 years. I want you to imagine watching your mother work herself sick to keep a roof over your head while your father buys another son a luxury car. And then, Derek, I want you to ask yourself if you would have done anything different than what I'm doing right now. I walked out of the Bentley Hotel into the bright San Francisco afternoon, my phone already buzzing with new messages. I ignored them all and drove to Golden Gate Park, found a quiet bench overlooking the Japanese tea garden, and called my attorney in Portland. Michael, it's Marcus. I need you to prepare paperwork for a bone marrow donation with specific conditions attached. The recipient must provide a notarized confession to federal crimes before the procedure. Is that legally enforceable? Michael was quiet for a moment. That's complicated. Medical procedures can't be legally contingent on unrelated agreements, but you can refuse to donate for any reason until conditions you personally require are met. It's ethically murky, but technically legal. Murky is fine, I said. Draw up the papers. That evening, my phone rang from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Richard's voice was weak, hoarse from treatment, but unmistakably him. Marcus, they told me your terms. I didn't respond, just listened. I deserve this, he continued. Everything you're asking for. I deserve. I was a coward and a terrible father. I chose easy over right, and I destroyed our family. But Marcus, please. Derek didn't know. He was a kid when I married Patricia. He grew up thinking Clearwater was legitimate. Don't destroy his future to punish me. Derek is 30, I said. Same age I was when I realized you were never coming back. He's old enough to face reality. He's your brother. He's a stranger who shares your DNA, I said, throwing Richard's own logic back at him. Blood means showing up. You taught me that. Richard made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You sound just like me, the me I was before I started cutting corners and lying to myself about what mattered. No, I said firmly. I sound like the man you should have been, the one who keeps his promises and takes responsibility, the one who doesn't abandon his son for a younger woman and a do-over family. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of hospital equipment beeping in the background. I'll sign your confession, Richard finally said. I'll put everything in writing. I'll face the prosecutors and the victims and whatever prison sentence comes. But please, Marcus, save Derek. He's innocent in this. Nobody's innocent, Richard. But I'll give him a chance you never gave me. The chance to choose who he wants to be when it matters most. The phone went dead. I sat on that park bench until sunset painted the sky orange and purple, thinking about my mother's question from the night before. What kind of man did I want to be when this was over? Did I want to be the son who saved his father only to watch him go to prison? Did I want to be the brother who forced Derek to testify against the man who'd given him everything? Or did I want to be the man who walked away and let Richard's leukemia deliver the justice the legal system might fumble? The answer crystallized as the last light faded from the sky. I wanted to be the man who forced them all to confront the truth, who made them pay the price for lies and abandonment, who saved Richard's life specifically so he could live long enough to lose everything that mattered to him, his freedom, his reputation, his son's respect. That was justice. That was proportional. That was the revenge that would satisfy the 18-year-old kid who'd watched his father drive away without looking back. 47 hours later, Patricia called. He signed it. Everything you asked for. The full confession, notarized, witnessed by his attorney. Derek has agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for immunity. We're ready to move forward with the transplant. Send me copies of the documents, I said. When I verify them with my attorney, I'll schedule the bone marrow harvest. Marcus, Patricia said, her voice breaking, I know you have every reason to hate us, but thank you for giving Richard a chance, for giving Derek a future. I'm not doing this for you, I said coldly. I'm doing this so Richard lives long enough to understand what he destroyed, so he spends years in a prison cell thinking about the son he threw away. That's not mercy, Patricia. That's punishment. The bone marrow harvest was scheduled for 2 weeks later at UCSF Medical Center. The procedure itself was straightforward. General anesthesia, needles into my hip bones, extraction of marrow stem cells. I would be sore for a few days. Richard would get a chance at 5 more years of life. Fair trade, considering what came next. The day before the harvest, my attorney delivered copies of Richard's confession to the U.S. Attorney's Office, along with Derek's cooperation agreement. The federal investigation that had been moving slowly suddenly accelerated. The documents I'd provided gave prosecutors everything they needed for indictments. Richard's confession was devastating. 7 years of fraud laid out in meticulous detail, complete with dates, dollar amounts, and the names of every official he'd bribed. Derek's testimony would corroborate everything and provide documentation prosecutors couldn't have obtained through warrants. The morning of the harvest, I arrived at UCSF at 6 a.m. The pre-op nurse was cheerful, making small talk about the weather while she inserted my IV. This is a wonderful thing you're doing, she said, adjusting the drip. Saving your father's life. He must be very proud of you. I didn't correct her. Let her believe this was a heartwarming story of family reconciliation. The truth was far more complicated and infinitely more satisfying. Richard was in a room down the hall, being prepared to receive the transplant. Patricia and Derek were in a waiting area somewhere, probably holding hands and praying to whatever God they thought might forgive fraud. My mother had offered to fly down from Sacramento, but I told her no. This wasn't a moment for support. This was a moment for solitary completion of a transaction 16 years in the making. The anesthesiologist introduced himself, explained the procedure one last time, and asked if I had any questions. Just one, I said as the sedation began to pull me under. When I wake up, I want to know the exact moment my bone marrow enters Richard Bennett's body. I want to know the precise second his life becomes dependent on mine. The anesthesiologist looked confused, but nodded. We'll note the time for you. Then the world faded to black, and when I woke up 3 hours later in recovery, a nurse informed me the transplant was complete. My bone marrow was now flowing through Richard's veins, rebuilding his immune system, saving his life. The irony was exquisite. The son he'd abandoned was now literally keeping him alive at the cellular level. I spent 2 days recovering at a hotel near the hospital, my hips aching from the extraction. Patricia sent fruit baskets and thank you notes that went straight into the trash. Derek called twice. I didn't answer. Richard sent a handwritten letter delivered by courier. I opened it only because my attorney advised documenting everything. Marcus, it read in shaky handwriting, I don't have words sufficient to thank you. You gave me life when you had every reason to let me die. I know the confession will destroy everything I built, but you were right to demand it. I spent years lying to myself about what I'd done, who I'd become. You forced me to face the truth. Whatever happens now, whatever prison sentence I receive, I'll spend that time thinking about the son I threw away. The brilliant, strong, uncompromising man you became despite my absence. I failed you. I'm sorry. Dad. I read it once, then tore it into pieces and threw it away. Words were cheap. Richard had proven that 16 years ago when he promised to visit and never did. Actions mattered. Consequences mattered. And Richard Bennett was about to face both with the full force of the federal justice system. 3 weeks after the transplant, the grand jury returned indictments. Richard was charged with wire fraud, money laundering, bribery of public officials, and criminal negligence in the Sanderson building collapse. Patricia was charged as a co-conspirator in the marketing fraud. The arrests happened on a Wednesday morning. Federal agents entering Clearwater Properties Glass Tower in downtown San Francisco with cameras from every news station in the Bay Area recording. Richard's perp walk made the front page of the Chronicle, disheveled, handcuffed, his face gray from chemotherapy, but his eyes meeting the cameras directly. He didn't hide. He didn't make excuses. He'd signed a confession that laid bare every crime, and now he faced the public consequences. Derek, wearing immunity like armor, walked into the federal courthouse the next day and spent 8 hours testifying before the grand jury. His testimony provided the corroborating evidence prosecutors needed to add additional charges. He cried twice during breaks, according to the news reports. His wife Stephanie filed for divorce 2 days later. The trust fund Richard had set up was frozen pending civil restitution claims from fraud victims. Derek's corner office at Clearwater was cleaned out by federal agents seizing evidence. Everything Richard had built for his second son vanished in less than a week. It was beautiful to watch from Portland, reading news articles over morning coffee, seeing the Bennett family empire crumble in real time. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, giving Richard time to recover from the transplant. The bone marrow took well, his blood counts improved, the leukemia went into remission. He would live to face justice. My attorney kept me updated on the proceedings. The Sanderson building victims filed a class action lawsuit. 3 marriages dissolved when wives discovered their husbands had known about the fraud. 2 Clearwater employees turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced charges. The Pacific Heights mansion went on the market to cover legal fees. Richard's reputation, carefully constructed over 30 years, disintegrated in headlines and court filings. The man who'd walked away from me with barely a backward glance now had nowhere to hide from the consequences of who he'd become. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to watch Richard sit in a defendant's chair or hear Derek's testimony from the witness stand. The outcome was predetermined the moment Richard signed that confession. Instead, I focused on my life in Portland, designing a sustainable housing project for a nonprofit, dating a marine biologist I'd met at a friend's wedding, training for a marathon along the Columbia River. I built the life Richard had abandoned me to build alone, and I built it well. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, sentencing set for 8 weeks later, my attorney called with the news. Richard's looking at 12 to 15 years federal prison, Michael said. With good behavior, maybe 10. The judge was harsh because of the Sanderson building victims. 4 people were injured, 1 permanently disabled. That weighed heavily. And Derek? I asked. Free and clear. The immunity held. He's cooperating with civil suits now, trying to help victims recover damages. I hear he's working at a nonprofit housing organization, making $9 an hour. His wife took most of their assets in the divorce. I thanked Michael and hung up. 12 to 15 years. Richard would be 70 to 73 when he got out, if the leukemia didn't return. He would lose the business he'd built, the reputation he'd cultivated, the son he'd groomed to take over. He would serve his time knowing the son he'd abandoned had saved his life specifically so he could face this reckoning. That was the revenge I'd planned from the moment Patricia's desperate Facebook message appeared. Not murder, not simple refusal, but forcing Richard to live with the consequences of every choice he'd made, every lie he'd told, every corner he'd cut, forcing him to understand that abandoning your son doesn't make him disappear. It makes him dangerous. Sentencing day arrived on a gray October morning. I'd thought about attending, watching Richard stand before the judge, but ultimately decided against it. This wasn't about me witnessing his fall. It was about him living it, breathing it, spending the next decade thinking about it in a prison cell. My mother called that afternoon with the news. 15 years, federal minimum security, eligible for parole after 12. Patricia was in the courtroom, Mom said quietly. She was crying. Derek sat in the back, stone-faced. Richard made a statement before sentencing. He said, she paused. He said his greatest regret wasn't the fraud or the lies. It was losing you. He said you turned out to be the best man in the family, and he only realized it when it was too late to matter. I stood at my apartment window, looking out at the Portland skyline, feeling nothing. That's a nice story, Mom, but regret doesn't rebuild 16 years. It doesn't return phone calls or attend graduations. It's just words. I know, sweetheart. I just thought you should hear it. We talked for a few more minutes, then said goodbye. I poured a glass of wine and sat on my balcony as the sun set over the city I'd built my life in, 2,137 miles from the wreckage of Richard Bennett's empire. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Derek, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know. I get it now. I understand what you did and why. Dad built my entire life on lies, and I was too comfortable to question it. You forced me to see the truth. It destroyed everything, but I needed to see it. Thank you, and I'm sorry for all of it. I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. Derek's epiphany came 15 years too late, and at a price he would never fully comprehend. 6 years have passed since Richard Bennett walked into federal prison in Lompoc, California. 6 years since the scandal that destroyed Clearwater Properties and sent shockwaves through San Francisco's real estate industry. 6 years since I donated my bone marrow to save a man who'd abandoned me, then watched him lose everything that mattered. I'm 40 now, living in Seattle after taking a position as senior engineer for a sustainable urban design firm. My marine biologist girlfriend became my wife 3 years ago. We have a daughter named Sophie, 18 months old, with my wife's green eyes and my stubborn determination. I built this life brick by brick, with no help from the Bennett family fortune, and I'm proud of every single piece. Richard's leukemia remains in remission. The transplant worked. My bone marrow rebuilt his immune system and gave him the years he needed to serve his sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in 6 more years, at age 70. I've received 4 letters from him over the past 6 years, all forwarded through my attorney. I've read none of them. Whatever Richard Bennett has to say to me now is irrelevant. He had 16 years to say it when it might have mattered. Patricia lost the Pacific Heights mansion to restitution claims. She's living in a modest apartment in Oakland, working as a paralegal, divorced from the lifestyle she'd married Richard to obtain. Derek rebuilt his life more successfully than I expected. He's director of affordable housing for a nonprofit in Sacramento, married to a social worker, father to twin boys. He sends Christmas cards every year with photos of his family. I throw them away unopened. Last month, I received a call from Richard's parole officer. Richard had listed me as his emergency contact for medical purposes. Apparently, I'm still his only viable bone marrow donor if the leukemia returns. The parole officer asked if I would be willing to donate again if needed. No, I said simply. I saved his life once so he could face justice. I won't do it again. Even if he's dying? The officer asked, shocked. Especially if he's dying, I replied. Richard Bennett used up his second chance. There won't be a third. I hung up and blocked the number. That evening, my wife found me on our back deck, staring at the Seattle skyline. Everything okay? She asked, sliding an arm around my waist. Richard might need another transplant, I said. His doctor reached out through the parole officer. Emily was quiet for a moment. She'd heard the whole story, knew every detail of the betrayal and the revenge. What did you tell them? I said no. Is that wrong? She kissed my cheek. You saved his life once and gave him the chance to face his consequences. You don't owe him anything more than that. You don't owe him forgiveness. You don't owe him absolution. You gave him justice. That's more than most people in your situation would have done. I pulled her closer, watching the sun set over Puget Sound, thinking about the man in federal prison whose blood still carried my genetic material. Richard Bennett's life depended on me twice. Once when he needed bone marrow, and once when his victims needed truth. I delivered both. But I don't owe him a third rescue. I don't owe him reconciliation or a relationship with his granddaughter. I don't owe him the satisfaction of a redemption story where the estranged son forgives and everyone learns valuable lessons about family. Some bridges burn completely. Some betrayals are too profound for forgiveness. And some sons become better men than their fathers, not because of guidance received, but because of lessons learned from abandonment. Richard Bennett taught me what not to be. He showed me the cost of choosing comfort over character, of building success on foundations of fraud and family destruction. He demonstrated that you can have everything: money, status, a beautiful wife, a son you're proud of, and still be bankrupt where it matters most. I learned those lessons well. I built my life as the opposite of his. Honest work, kept promises, showing up for people who depend on me. When Sophie is old enough to ask about her grandfather, I'll tell her the truth. Not to poison her against him, but to help her understand that blood relation doesn't obligate you to toxic people. That forgiveness is earned through changed behavior, not demanded through shared DNA. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you and build something better without them. Derek sent another Christmas card this month. I nearly threw it away like all the others, but Emily intercepted it. "Maybe read this one," she suggested gently. "You don't have to respond, but maybe see what he has to say." I opened it, finding a photo of Derek's family, him, his wife, twin boys around 5 years old. On the back, a handwritten note. "Marcus, I know you probably won't read this, but I'm sending it anyway because my sons asked why they don't know their uncle. I told them about you, about how you're the smartest, strongest person in our family, about how you forced us all to face the truth when we were living in comfortable lies. My boys know their grandfather is in prison for fraud. They know I testified against him. They know we lost everything because we built it on stolen foundations. And they know their uncle Marcus is the one who demanded accountability when nobody else would. I'm raising them to be like you, not like Dad. Thank you for that template, even though you never meant to provide it. Derek." I showed Emily the note. She read it twice, then looked at me with those green eyes that see through all my defenses. "Are you going to respond?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Derek didn't choose the fraud. He'd been raised in it, immersed in it, taught that success meant Richard's version of cutting corners and lying to clients. The revelation destroyed his marriage, his career, his trust fund. He rebuilt from scratch, just like I did, and apparently learned the lesson Richard never could. "Maybe," I said finally. "Not today, not this year. But maybe eventually, when Sophie is older and asks about cousins. Maybe then I'll let Derek prove he's really different from Richard." Emily smiled. "That's fair. Forgiveness doesn't have a deadline. You get to decide when or if you're ready." That night, I filed Derek's Christmas card in a drawer instead of throwing it away. Not absolution, not reconciliation. Just acknowledgement that some people learn from consequences and some don't. Derek lost everything and chose to rebuild as someone better. Richard lost everything and, according to the letters I refused to read, still doesn't understand why I forced his reckoning. The difference between them clarifies daily. Richard sends letters begging for contact, for a relationship with his granddaughter, for a chance to apologize in person. He wants closure, forgiveness, the neat resolution his conscience demands. I give him none of it. Derek sends annual Christmas cards with no demands, no request for meetings, just updates and acknowledgement of the breach between us. He's accepted that reconciliation happens on my timeline, if at all. That's the difference between entitlement and humility, between demanding forgiveness and earning the possibility of it. Richard still thinks he's owed a second son's devotion because we share blood. Derek understands that family is built through choices, not chromosomes, through showing up, not showing off, through admitting wrongs, not minimizing them. My daughter Sophie will grow up knowing her Uncle Derek exists, but her grandfather doesn't. Not in any meaningful way. She'll know her father saved a man's life so he could face justice for the lives he damaged. She'll understand that sometimes the right thing feels cruel, that accountability looks like punishment, that love without boundaries enables destruction. She'll learn these lessons not from Richard Bennett's mistakes, but from my choices about how to respond to those mistakes. That's the legacy that matters. Not the bone marrow I donated, or the confession I extracted, or the revenge I executed, but the example I set for my daughter about consequences and accountability and refusing to accept breadcrumbs from people who owe you banquets. Richard Bennett stole 16 years from me. I stole his freedom, his reputation, and his illusions about who he was. Where even now, he's alive because of me and in prison because of himself. That's the justice I demanded and the peace I've made. The rest of his life is his to live in a 6x8 cell, contemplating the son he abandoned who became the man who wouldn't let him hide from his crimes. I sleep well at night knowing Richard Bennett has plenty of time to think about what he destroyed and what he could never destroy. My mother asked me once, about 2 years after the sentencing, if I ever regretted forcing the confession. If I ever wished I'd just donated the marrow and walked away, letting karma handle Richard without my intervention. No, I told her without hesitation. Karma is too slow and too uncertain. Richard spent 30 years cutting corners and bribing officials and putting people in danger. He got rich doing it. He built Derek a perfect life doing it. If I'd just walked away, he would have died thinking he got away with it all. This way, he lives knowing exactly what he lost and why he lost it. Mom nodded slowly. You're harder than I raised you to be? No, I corrected. I'm exactly as hard as the world forced me to become when Richard walked away. You taught me integrity and accountability. Richard taught me that sometimes you have to enforce those things yourself because the universe doesn't automatically punish bad people. She'd hugged me then, and I felt her silent agreement. She'd watched Richard abandon us, watched me struggle through college on scholarships and construction wages, watched him build a mansion while we scraped by. She'd earned her own quiet satisfaction in his fall, even if she was too kind to say it out loud. The Sanderson building victims reached out to me during the civil trial. 4 people whose lives were permanently altered when that compromised structure partially collapsed during routine maintenance. The woman who'd been paralyzed from the waist down wanted to thank me personally for providing the evidence that made their lawsuit possible. We met at a coffee shop in San Francisco, and she rolled her wheelchair up to the table with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Bennett," she said, and I winced at the name. "Marcus," I corrected. "Just Marcus." "Marcus," she repeated. "I wanted you to know that your father's confession gave us something the insurance companies never could: acknowledgement. He admitted in writing that he falsified those inspection reports, that he knew the building was unsafe, that he prioritized profit over safety. Because of you, we got truth." I'd prepared a dozen responses to that meeting, but sitting across from a 32-year-old former dancer who would never walk again because Richard Bennett wanted to save money on proper structural steel, all my prepared words evaporated. "I'm sorry," I said and meant it. "I'm sorry Richard was allowed to operate for so long. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. I'm sorry your life was destroyed by his greed." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're not responsible for his choices, but you are responsible for making sure he faced them. That matters more than you know." We talked for an hour. She told me about her dance company, her plans to teach from her wheelchair, her determination to build something meaningful from the wreckage Richard had left. I told her about Sophie, about Seattle, about building a life on honest foundations. When we parted, she said something that stays with me still. "Your father gave me this wheelchair, but you gave me justice. I know which gift matters more." The Federal Bureau of Prisons has a victim notification system. I'm registered to receive updates whenever Richard's status changes: parole hearings, medical emergencies, custody level adjustments. 3 years ago, he had a health scare, potential leukemia relapse, and the notification system flagged me as his registered bone marrow donor. The prison medical staff requested I undergo testing to determine if another donation would be viable. I responded through my attorney with a single sentence: "Mr. Bennett is not available for donation at this time or any future time." The prison doctor called me directly, bypassing the attorney. "Mr. Bennett, I understand there's history here, but your father's condition is serious. Without a transplant, he'll die," I finished. "Yes, I understand. My answer remains no. But you're the only match, the only person who can save him." "Incorrect," I said calmly. "I'm the only person who saved him once. The leukemia relapse isn't my responsibility. It's biology. Richard Bennett used his second chance to serve a prison sentence for fraud. He doesn't get a third chance from me." The doctor was silent for a long moment. "That's incredibly cold." "That's incredibly fair," I corrected. "Richard had 18 years to be my father. He chose not to. I had one opportunity to require accountability. I chose to take it. We both made our choices. We both live with the consequences." The relapse turned out to be a false alarm. Elevated markers that stabilized with medication. Richard would live to complete his sentence. But that phone call clarified something important. I wasn't interested in being Richard's perpetual life raft. I'd pulled him from drowning once, on my terms, for my reasons. If the ocean came for him again, he'd face it alone. That wasn't cruelty. That was boundaries. That was recognizing that I'd given Richard Bennett more than he'd ever given me, the chance to live with his choices instead of escaping them through death. Derek's twins turned 6 last month. The Christmas card this year included a drawing from one of them, a stick figure family labeled me, daddy, mommy, brother, Uncle Marcus. The last figure stood apart from the others, across a gulf of white paper. Emily found me staring at that drawing for 20 minutes. "That's remarkably perceptive for a 6-year-old, she observed, "to know you're part of the family but separate from it." "Derek probably explained it that way," I said. "How do you feel about that?" Emily asked. "About being the uncle who exists in theory but not in practice?" I thought about it. I feel like that kid drew the truth. I am separate. I'm connected by blood and history, but not by choice or relationship. That's honest. That's accurate. That's okay. But Sophie saw the drawing too, and at 18 months, she was just starting to understand words like cousin and family. She pointed at the stick figures. Who? I picked her up, held her close. That's your cousin, and your other cousin, and your Uncle Derek, who you might meet someday when you're older. Why not now? She asked with toddler logic. Because some relationships take time to build, I said. Like how we're building your playhouse in the backyard, one board at a time, making sure it's strong before we add the next piece. She seemed satisfied with that answer. Emily wasn't. Are you building towards something with Derek? She asked later. Or is this permanent distance? I don't know yet, I admitted. Derek's proven he's different from Richard. He lost everything and chose accountability over comfort. He rebuilt himself into someone better. That deserves acknowledgement, eventually, but I'm not ready to trust easily. Richard taught me that blood relation doesn't guarantee character. Last spring, Derek reached out through my attorney. The first time he'd done more than send Christmas cards. He'd been offered a position as director of a sustainable housing nonprofit in Seattle. He wanted to know if my presence in the city would be a problem, if he should decline the opportunity to avoid making me uncomfortable. It was considerate, thoughtful, the kind of gesture Richard would never have made. I told my attorney to inform Derek that Seattle was big enough for both of us, that he should take the job if it was right for him, but that I wasn't ready for regular contact. Give it time, I said. If he's genuinely changed, that'll become clear through actions, not proximity. Derek took the job. We've run into each other exactly twice in 6 months. Once at a professional conference on sustainable urban design, once at a farmer's market in Ballard. Both times, he nodded respectfully, didn't approach, gave me space to decide whether to engage. Both times I nodded back and kept walking. Emily thinks I'm testing him. She's probably right. I'm watching to see if Derek respects boundaries, if he understands that reconciliation happens on my timeline, if he's willing to earn trust instead of demanding it because we're brothers. So far, he's passing. That doesn't mean I'm ready to have coffee and discuss our childhoods, but it means I'm watching, evaluating, leaving the possibility open instead of slamming it shut. Richard, meanwhile, continues writing letters I don't read. My attorney scans them and provides summaries. The content is apparently consistent. Apologies, regrets, requests to meet Sophie. Promises that he's a changed man. Classic Richard Bennett, thinking the right words can erase 16 years of absence and 7 years of fraud, thinking he can serve 6 years in prison and emerge deserving forgiveness. The parole board will hear his case in 6 more years. I've already filed a victim impact statement opposing his early release, not because I'm vindictive, but because I remember the Sanderson building victims, because I remember Derek's destroyed life, because I remember my mother working double shifts while Richard bought his new son a BMW. Accountability doesn't expire after a few years of good behavior. Richard Bennett earned a 15-year sentence. He should serve 15 years. My daughter will be 7 when Richard is eligible for parole. Old enough to ask questions if he's released. Old enough to be curious about the grandfather whose photos don't appear in our house. Emily and I have discussed how to handle that conversation when it comes. We've agreed on honesty without venom, explaining that Richard made choices that hurt people, that he went to prison for those choices, that forgiveness is something Sophie can decide for herself when she's older. We won't poison her against him, but we won't pretend he's someone he's not. She'll know her grandfather exists. She'll know why he's not in her life. She'll understand that family is something you build through trust and presence, not something you're automatically entitled to because of genetics. Sometimes, late at night when Sophie is asleep and Emily is reading in bed, I think about alternative timelines. What if I'd refused the bone marrow donation entirely? Richard would have died within months. The Clearwater investigation might have stalled without his confession. Derek might never have faced the truth about his trust fund's origins. The Sanderson building victims might still be fighting insurance companies instead of holding a confirmed guilty party accountable. Would that timeline be better or worse? I don't know. But I know this timeline, the one where I saved Richard specifically so he could face justice, feels right. It feels proportional. It feels like the kind of accountability that actually means something. My mother visits Seattle twice a year now. Last visit, she met Derek by accident at the farmer's market, the same one where I'd seen him months before. They talked for 20 minutes while I waited in the car with Sophie. When Mom returned, she was thoughtful. He's very different from Richard, she said carefully. He asked about you, not demanding contact, just asking if you're happy, if you're doing well. I told him you're building a good life. He said that was all he needed to know. What do you think? I asked. Should I give him a chance? Mom was quiet for a long moment. I think Derek paid for Richard's sins in ways that weren't entirely fair. He lost his marriage, his career, his trust fund. Everything Richard built for him turned to ash. But unlike Richard, he didn't make excuses. He didn't blame you. He started over and did it honestly. That says something about character. But, I prompted, knowing there was more. But you don't owe him reconciliation just because he learned his lesson, Mom continued. You don't owe him a relationship because he's trying to be better. You only owe him consideration if and when you're ready to give it. And maybe you'll never be ready. That's okay too. She's right, of course. Derek's redemption arc doesn't obligate me to participate in it. His growth doesn't require my validation. If he's genuinely changed, he'll prove it through years of consistent choices, not through a few considerate gestures and annual Christmas cards. And if I eventually decide to let him into Sophie's life, into our family sphere, it'll be because he's earned that trust brick by brick, the same way I built my life after Richard abandoned me. The truth is, I don't think about Richard Bennett much anymore. He's become background noise, annual parole notifications, attorney summaries of unread letters, occasional news articles about white-collar criminals serving time. He's not a father to me. He's barely a memory. He's a cautionary tale I'll tell my daughter someday about the cost of choosing comfort over character. Derek is more complicated. He exists in this liminal space between stranger and family, between the brother who benefited from my absence and the man who paid dearly when the truth emerged. I don't know yet which version of Derek wins out. Time will tell. Actions will tell. And I'll be watching with the same calculated patience I used when extracting Richard's confession. 6 years ago, I saved a man's life so he could lose his freedom. I forced a family to confront the fraud that funded their lifestyle. I made my half-brother choose between protecting his father and protecting his future. Some people might call that revenge. I call it justice. Some people might say I should have been the bigger person and donated the marrow without conditions. I say I was the biggest person in that hospital conference room. Big enough to demand accountability, big enough to enforce consequences, big enough to refuse to let Richard escape through death, the reckoning he'd avoided through life. Richard Bennett stole 16 years from me. I can't get those back, but I can make sure the years he has left are spent understanding exactly what he destroyed. Every day in federal prison, he wakes up alive because of the son he abandoned. Every day he faces the consequences of the crimes I forced him to confess. Every day he knows that Derek chose truth over loyalty because I gave him no other option. That's not cruelty. That's poetry. That's the universe balancing scales that Richard thought he'd tipped permanently in his favor. He thought abandoning me meant I'd disappear, become irrelevant, fade into his rearview mirror like a discarded mistake. Instead, I became the person who held up a mirror and forced him to see what he'd become. The fraud, the lies, the casual destruction of other people's lives, all of it exposed by the son who was supposed to be worthless. They said I was worthless. They said I was the mistake, the baggage from Richard's first marriage, the kid who didn't fit into the new family's perfect picture. They were wrong. I was the reckoning. I was the consequence they never saw coming. I was the son who understood that sometimes love means letting someone face the full weight of their choices, even if it destroys them. Especially if it destroys them. Because that's the only way people like Richard Bennett learn. When the bill finally comes due and there's no one left to pay it except themselves. And now, 6 years later, I'm living proof that you don't need your father's approval or your family's acceptance to build something meaningful. You don't need forgiveness or reconciliation to move forward. You just need boundaries, accountability, and the spine to enforce both. Richard Bennett gave me nothing but genetic material and a template for who not to become. I took those raw materials and built a life he'll never touch, a family he'll never know, a legacy that has nothing to do with his last name and everything to do with my choices. Sophie will grow up knowing her worth isn't determined by who shows up for her, but by who she chooses to become. She'll understand that family is built through consistency, not biology. She'll learn that accountability matters more than comfort, that truth matters more than peace, that some bridges need to burn completely so you can build something better on the other side. Those are the lessons Richard taught me through his absence, and those are the lessons I'll pass to my daughter, not through bitterness or revenge, but through the example of a life well lived despite, and perhaps because of, the father who walked away. Richard Bennett will die in prison or shortly after release, and I'll feel nothing when it happens. Not satisfaction, not grief. Just the quiet acknowledgement that a chapter ended the way it had to. Derek might become part of Sophie's life eventually, or he might remain the uncle on Christmas cards, forever separate. That's yet to be determined. But I know this with certainty. I don't need either of them. I don't need Richard's deathbed apology or Derek's fraternal connection. I built something they can't touch and don't deserve access to. I saved Richard's life and destroyed his legacy, and both actions came from the same place. The recognition that I had power in that hospital conference room, and I chose to use it not for mercy, but for justice. That's my epilogue. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, not the neat Hollywood ending where everyone learns and grows and hugs it out. Just the truth. Richard Bennett abandoned the wrong son. He threw away the one who would have demanded he be better, who would have refused to enable fraud, who would have held him accountable before federal agents had to. He chose Derek, compliant, comfortable Derek who never questioned where the money came from. And that choice cost Richard everything. His freedom, his reputation, his empire, and ultimately his relationship with both sons. One he never knew. One who testified against him. Both consequences of the same fundamental failure. The belief that you can walk away from your responsibilities and build something good on that foundation of abandonment. You can't. The ground always shifts. The bills always come due. And sometimes, the son you threw away grows up to be the man holding the invoice, demanding payment in full, refusing every discount and excuse. That's not revenge. That's just accounting. Richard Bennett thought he could abandon me and face no consequences. He learned otherwise. And he had to stay alive, forced to breathe by my bone marrow, to learn that lesson completely. That's justice. That's closure. That's the ending Richard earned, and the one I was strong enough to deliver. They said I was worthless. My father's life depended on the son they abandoned, and I saved him, not out of love, but to ensure he lived long enough to lose everything that mattered. That's how you balance scales that were tipped for 16 years. That's how you teach accountability to people who think they're above it. That's how a worthless son becomes the most valuable person in the room. By refusing to accept the role they assigned him and writing his own ending instead. The bone marrow was just biology. The confession was justice. And the life I built 2,137 miles from Richard's wreckage? That's victory. Complete, permanent, and entirely mine.